So I'm glad to say that Henrik managed to kind of connect with us. So I'm handing over the floor to him. He's based at the German Institute of Urban Affairs in Berlin, and we'll be talking about multi-level crisis management in Germany, not only at the federal level, but from the title, I would assume also even the European level and the local level. So Henrik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wilfried, for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me here. I would like indeed to share some observations with you about the federal corona crisis management in Germany in a multi-level perspective. And insofar I would go a step back and will some information, some observations to the presentation of Yvonne and Johanna. Yeah, and I will do so in looking on the different levels in the European multi-level system, having a special view on the federal level on the one side, including the EU level, and the states and municipality level on the other side. It's, from my point of view, a very interesting case of how federalism changed over the corona crisis and all the other crises which we are facing in these times. We now are seeing the Ukraine crisis and energy crisis, but before we had all these other crises, the refugee crisis and so on and so on. And all these crises, that's my thesis, are changing the federal face of also Germany and changing the federal architecture of the German federal system. I will start with a very brief overview about the measures which mainly the federal government set up in the last two crises, the corona crisis from 2020 onwards and the Ukraine crisis from 2020. And you can see, I don't want to go in greater detail, but what you see here is that the federal government set up different measures which are which are financially really strong. The federal government took a lot of money into its hands and to distribute it to the states and the municipalities. For example, this kind of Corona Shield for Germany, that's the largest stimulus package in the history of the Federal Republic, as the Federal Ministry of Finance says, with around 350 billion euros plus around 800 billion euros for guarantees for the economy. And there we have different other programs, and all these measures are supplemented by further measures due to the energy crisis in the course of the Ukraine war. And here we have around 365 billion euros for different measures, 3 relief packages, including energy price flat rates for the employees, and we have set up a special fund for the German armed forces with a volume of 100 billion euros and 200 billion euros also in a special fund for fighting against the energy crisis. So a lot of money in the system, and how are these measures are implemented. That's the main focus of my presentation, and that is the main interest in asking how does all this money and all these measures are changing the federal phase of Germany, or the federal architecture of Germany. We see that, of course, the executive and the federal government has a very strong position in all these processes. Sorry, I have to go a step back because I forgot another big program, and that is the European Recovery and Resilience Facility as a part of the so-called Next Generation EU fund. And this fund has a German counterpart as in other member states of the EU, and that's the so-called German Recovery and Resilience Plan, shortly DARP. And that are another 28 billion euros coming from the EU for investment grants, subsidies, and government consumptions, and another 28 billion euros to combat the crisis, the Corona crisis, a kind of stimulus package against the Corona crisis, another 28 billion euro, which Germany gets from the EU. And the main question, as I mentioned, is how does these measures change the federal architecture? The funding priorities, it might be interesting for you, or funding priorities and the spending volumes of all these programs, a very strong focus on climate policy and energy transition, on the digitization of education, strengthening of social participation, strengthening of the healthcare system, and the last point is also very interesting for a modernization of the administration and dismantling barriers to investment. All these fields are highly critical and were part of long-lasting conflicts between the different levels in Germany, between the federal government and the states and the municipalities. And if you have a clear look on these funding priorities, you see that many of these fields are in the competence sphere of the states and the municipalities, and the federal government interferes here with a lot of money in competence fields of the states and the municipalities. What are the main features of this crisis management? I will sum it up very shortly. As you all know, economic crisis and recessions are times for central governments and executives. That's clear observation, and that's also true for the Corona crisis management in Germany, and also the energy crisis management which we are facing right now. But in Germany, the federal government has exploited the window of opportunity in a special way, since it dominated the whole process, and at many points the states and the municipalities were not involved, or were only involved after decisions were made. So the agenda was very much shaped by the federal government, and also the decisions about all these financial programs, investment programs, were made by the federal government and the so-called coalition committee, the Koalitionsausschuss of the parties that make up the federal government. There were in this coalition committee were no representatives of the states and municipalities. So what we see here is a clear process which is dominated by the central or the federal government. What we also see is a very strong expansion of the spending and spending activities, and the overall debt of the federal government was very much increased, especially here of the federal government, but also of the states. And what we see in regard with this is a kind of overstretching of the debt brake. As you might know, 2009 we have set up a constitutional debt brake to decrease the overall public debt. And yeah, this debt, the German finance minister and also the government is always very proud of these debt brake. And now what we see now is a kind of overstretching. And yeah, from my point of view and many other observers, it is meanwhile this debt brake is only working on the paper, but it has only less to do with the original idea which leads to the debt brake in the constitution. And yeah, a kind of overstretching of the debt brake. Yeah, and many of these debts were outsourced in special funds outside the federal budget. That is quite problematic because it isn't that transparent as it would be if we had these debt in the budget. And so that's also from a financial point of view problematic. Yeah, what we see also is a strong expansion of investment support programs for the states and the municipalities. But in the energy crisis also we see individual compensation payments for the employees and the citizens. And yeah, we see various new temporary investment programs instead of a general purposeless block grants for financially weaker regions. And that's insofar a problem since the number of these investment programs increased over the last decade. And we have so many investment programs that a high number of municipalities is complaining about these number because they are not anymore able to apply for money from these programs. They have not the administrative capacities, and insofar, yeah, it is it's an ambivalent instrument, these investment programs. Various measures were already formulated by the federal government in 2022 as part of the domestic anti-corona stimulus program. That is the point with regard to the European program. So the German recovery and resilience plan is thus partly refinancing the expenditures of the Bund with money from the EU. So the Bund here exploited the situation, as I mentioned earlier. He is the Bund is refinancing its own stimulus package with money from the EU, because many of these measures which were defined in the German recovery and resilience plan were already formulated earlier in a German stimulus package. Yeah, with regard to the investment programs, it is the problem that the states, the municipalities and companies must apply for funds, grants, where given in a competitive process, there's no free availability, and the priorities are set by the federal government. And so far, yeah, the states and municipalities have to apply apply for programs which are defined very much defined by the federal government. And the disadvantage of this project-based allocation of funds is that the already financially stronger and responsive lender and municipalities will be further strengthened. What we see, and that's a problem, what we see is that financially weaker municipalities and lender are not that able to apply for these money because they haven't got the capacities, the administrative capacities, the personnel to apply for such grants. Yeah, and that is a point I already mentioned. The lender and grant recipients complained already today that these investment programs include a very complex application, accounting procedures, and the municipalities have hardly any capacity today to apply for funds since the number of programs increased over the last years. And in using the figure of Fritz Sharp, you could talk about a kind of implementation trap, not a joint decision-making trap anymore, because the main decisions are made by the federal government, but the implementation is now the problem. The implementation of these programs, we have sufficient money in this system. As you could see at the beginning of my presentation, there are billions of euros in the system, but we have these administrative hurdles and we have a lack of capacities. We have the construction industry, which has not the personnel to implement construction measures in the infrastructure, for example, and so on and so on. And so far, we become more and more these kind of implementation problems, that many of these measures, which have a good intention, could not be implemented in time, and it took a lot of time, and we have these delay, we have these investment backlog, especially on the municipality level. We see a backlog of 160 billion euros investments which were not made in the last years, and the infrastructure which becomes better and better, and that's a real problem. And so far, this approach of crisis management has problems. Yeah, and what we also see is that in the whole process of these many investment programs is that the Federal Court of Auditors was strengthened. Also in the Constitution, the Federal Court of Auditors has now special auditing rights down to the municipal level. So we can talk, that's my view, we can talk of a kind of change in the political culture. We see a kind of shadow of the courts of auditors as a break on an investment offensive and the necessary increase in personnel in the administration, because always the court of auditors as well from the federal as also the state levels are warning about too many revenues, and they break all these investment activities, and so that is one another observation. And yeah, with regard to the European recovery and resilience facility, there is of course a kind of dilemma because the federal government has the sole right of external representation vis-à-vis the EU, but the concrete implementation of the EU's recovery and resilience facility takes place at the level of the states and municipalities, and that explains this kind of gap that the federal government has this leading role in formulating the German recovery and resilience plan without taking the Länder and the municipalities into the drafting process, and so the federal government had this chance to dominate the agenda, to set up the priorities, and so on and so on. Yeah, that has to do with these external representation right vis-à-vis the EU, and yeah, that's a fundamental problem in this European multi-level system, that the EU system is a kind of blind against the states and the municipalities in federal states. Yeah, so far some
Henrik,
observations. Yeah.
Henrik, can I interrupt? Can I
Yeah.
invite you to conclude? We want to have about 20 minutes for Q&A before we break for lunchtime here. Thank you.
That was also my last observation, and so far I can close up, and thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Let me do the math. 5 of you for very, very stimulating presentations. I'm not going to take too much time. We only have about 20 minutes. If anybody has a question, and hopefully I would invite you to confine yourself to questions, pointed preferably.